Rain didn't wash away her tears. Mrs. Gable sat on my porch, trembling. Her husband, a man who knows the sea better than his own kids, was broken. The sheriff's men took everything, every crate, every fish. They told him to stay away from the port or face a cell. Something felt wrong. Sheriffs don't seize a local catch for inspections at 3 in the morning, not unless they're hiding something. I looked at Rusty. He knew the drill. We weren't going there to talk. We were going there to see. The port is a fortress, but every fortress has a crack. I just had to find it before the sun went down. Rusty, today we work in absolute silence, I whispered. He didn't bark. He just leaned into the harness, professional. We drove lights off. The ocean breeze smelled like diesel and salt, the kind of smell that usually precedes trouble. 3 guards at the main gate, all carrying sidearms. That's a lot of firepower for a fish warehouse. I checked my watch. The patrol rotates every 20 minutes. We had a narrow window to move. 1 camera, 1 lock, and a whole lot of secrets behind those corrugated steel walls. Time to move. Thank you for being here. Please subscribe and like this video. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments so I know who's listening. Moving through the yard was like navigating a minefield of light. Every step had to be calculated. The guards were focused on the main gates, leaving the shadows between the containers as our only path. I looked up at the roof of the main hangar. It was 30 feet of vertical steel. No stairs, no ladder. Just a rusted gutter and a narrow ledge that led to the ventilation intake. Lifting 60 pounds of muscle and teeth isn't easy, but Rusty makes it look like a drill. He didn't make a sound as I hauled him up. We've done this 100 times in worse places. The vent cover was old, the screws rusted through. A little pressure and it popped. The air coming out smelled like stale grease and old sea salt. It was our way in. It was a tight squeeze. Every movement sounded like thunder in my ears, but to anyone outside, it was just the building settling. Rusty crawled behind me, his breathing rhythmic and steady. Dogs sense things we don't. He slowed down, his nose working the air. He smelled something that didn't belong in a fish warehouse, something metallic, something chemical. We reached the main junction. Below us, the hangar was a hive of activity. These weren't dock workers. These guys moved with the kind of discipline you only see in private security or paramilitary. I counted 6 of them, all armed. They were crowded around a fresh shipment, Mrs. Gable's husband's catch. They were looking for something specific, and they were in a hurry. They weren't looking for spoiled fish. They were harvesting a different kind of catch. One of the deputies sliced a tuna open with professional precision, and it didn't bleed. Out came a heavy, vacuum-sealed brick of black plastic. Gold bullion, antique jewelry, and packets of high-value contraband were nestled inside the hollowed-out carcasses. The Chesney Fisherman's Hall had been turned into a Trojan horse for a massive shadow economy right under our noses. The sheriff stood there like a king counting his tribute. He wasn't just a dirty cop taking a cut. He was the architect of the whole smuggling ring. Every piece of jewelry he touched represented someone's loss, someone's life savings being funneled through this port. This wasn't a small-time operation. This was a systematic drain of wealth, perfectly camouflaged in the mundane routine of a local fishery where no honest man would ever think to look for a crime. Rusty's instincts were sharper than mine. He saw the guard lean over a crate, and he saw the moment the black leather ledger slipped from a loose cargo pocket. The book landed on a support beam just 3 inches below our hiding spot. That ledger was the Holy Grail. It likely held names, bank accounts, and the entire logistics of the sheriff's operation. It was the only piece of physical evidence that could turn our observations into an airtight federal case. I didn't need to give a command. The bond between us was silent and absolute. Rusty reached through the metal bars with the steady hand of a bomb technician. He hooked the corner of a yellow manifest sticking out of the book and began to drag it slowly into the shadows of the vent. One slip, one scratch of metal on metal, and we'd be dead. But the dog knew the stakes. He wasn't just a pet. He was an operative, securing the proof we needed to survive the night. I kept the lens focused and the recording rolling, capturing every face, every badge, and every incriminating exchange. This footage was the key to clearing Gable's name and dismantling the sheriff's empire. But as I watched them work, the sheer scale of the operation started to sink in. This wasn't just about fish and gold. It was a hub for international trafficking. The rot didn't stop at the county line. It went all the way to the top of the state's coastal authority. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. The sheriff stopped mid-sentence, his head tilting like a predator catching a strange scent. He looked straight up at our vent, his eyes searching the darkness behind the steel grates. Silence is usually our best friend, but in a loud warehouse, a sudden lack of movement can be just as loud as a gunshot. I felt my heart hammer against my ribs as his hand drifted toward his holster. He knew something was up there. The hunt was about to begin. "We've got company!" the sheriff barked, his voice echoing like a crack of thunder against the metal walls. I didn't wait for the first shot. I grabbed Rusty by the harness handle and rolled backward just as the first 9mm round tore through the metal slats where my head had been a second ago. The sound was deafening inside the enclosed duct, a metallic scream of lead meeting steel. There was no more hiding. The ghost in the machine had been spotted, and the hunters had just become the prey. I felt the adrenaline surge, that familiar cold clarity that comes when the talking stops and the survival starts. They thought they had us pinned, but they were still thinking in 2 dimensions. In my world, the ceiling is just another floor if you know how to move. I reached for the small smoke canister on my chest rig. It wasn't about concealment anymore. It was about chaos. I popped the pin, waited 2 seconds, and dropped it through the jagged hole the bullets had chewed in the grate. Thick, acrid gray smoke began to billow out, pouring downward like a waterfall of fog. "Mask up, Rusty," I muttered, pulling my own respirator over my face. We needed a distraction to bridge the gap between the ceiling and the floor, and the sheriff had just given us the opening. The smell of burning sulfur filled the duct, a bitter reminder of every tight spot I'd ever been in. Rusty didn't flinch. He knew that the cloud was our shield, a temporary curtain between us and the barrels of their guns. We didn't use the stairs. We used gravity. I leaped from the ledge, catching the edge of a stack of crates to break my fall, with Rusty landing right beside me like a shadow made of muscle. The crates were marked with the same fish logo as Gable's boat, a bitter irony. Below us, the deputies were coughing and shouting, their silhouettes dancing in the thickening fog. They expected us to stay trapped in the ceiling, but a seal never stays in a box. We were on their level now, and the playing field was suddenly much more interesting. I could hear the heavy thud of boots on concrete and the frantic clicking of radios. They were confused, and in combat, confusion is the only advantage you need. I signaled Rusty to stay low. The next 30 seconds would decide if we made it to the water. We hit the floor and disappeared into the labyrinth of steel. The warehouse was a maze of containers and heavy machinery, a perfect playground for a K-9 team. I could hear the sheriff screaming orders, his voice high-pitched and panicked. He knew that if we got out with that footage, his life was over. "Search every corner! Kill the dog first!" he yelled. I tightened my grip on Rusty's lead. That was his first mistake, making it personal. I checked the exit to the north. It was blocked by 2 guards with shotguns. To the south, the loading docks were crawling with activity. We were boxed in, but every box has a lid. I looked at the overhead crane system. It was old, noisy, and exactly what we needed to bypass the perimeter. I'm not an agent with a suitcase full of gadgets. I'm a man who knows how to use his environment. I grabbed a bottle of industrial degreaser from a nearby maintenance shelf and taped a flare to it. Simple, crude, and effective. I tossed it toward the main power hub on the far side of the hangar. The flare ignited the fumes, creating a sudden blinding flash of white light and a roar that sounded like a localized explosion. The guards instinctively turned away, shielding their eyes. "Now, Rusty, go!" I hissed. We broke cover, sprinting across the open floor while the echoes of the distraction still rattled the rafters. My lungs burned from the exertion, but there was no time to breathe. We had 5 seconds before they realized the fire was just a show. We moved like ghosts through the steam. The explosion had done its job, drawing their eyes and their muzzles away from the loading docks for just a heartbeat. I could hear the heavy thud of my boots hitting the wet concrete, a rhythmic counterpoint to the frantic beating of my heart. "Almost there, buddy," I whispered, though the wind of our movement carried the words away. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and burnt chemicals. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every clank of metal like a signal. We were running a gauntlet, and the only way out was forward. I didn't look back. In this game, looking back is how you lose your lead. I threw my weight against the emergency exit. The rusted iron shrieked in protest, a sound that surely gave away our position, but there was no turning back. The cold, salt-laden night air hit my face like a slap, clearing the sting of the smoke from my lungs. We were out of the hangar, but we weren't safe. The pier was a long, exposed stretch of timber and concrete. To our left, the main gate was blocked by 2 cruisers. To our right, the water. My choice was made before I even stepped outside. The water was my home, my sanctuary. I grabbed the waterproof bag from my belt, checked the seal on the camera and the ledger receipt, and looked at Rusty. He knew. He didn't hesitate. "Stop! Don't move!" A voice screamed from the shadows. A rifle barked, and a chunk of the pier's railing disintegrated inches from my hip. They were closing in, desperate to stop the truth from leaving the harbor. I felt a sharp sting as a splinter grazed my cheek, but I didn't flinch. I had the evidence. I had the dog. And I had a 3-story drop into the blackest water I'd ever seen. "Trust me, Rusty," I said, grabbing the handle of his harness. The sheriff appeared behind his men, his face twisted in a mask of pure rage. He raised his pistol, but he was too late. We were already committed to the fall. Gravity took us. For a second, the world was silent, the wind rushing past my ears and the weightlessness taking over. It's a feeling I've had 1,000 times. The leap of faith into the unknown. Below us, the harbor water looked like liquid ink, cold and unforgiving. I kept my grip tight on Rusty, ensuring we'd hit the surface together. Above, the pier erupted in gunfire, the muzzle flashes like angry fireflies in the night. They were shooting at shadows, at the memory of where we had been. We hit the water with a bone-jarring impact, the cold piercing through my tactical gear like 1,000 needles. The silence of the deep took over. the chaos of the warehouse, the screams of the sheriff, the crack of the rifles, it all vanished, replaced by the muffled heartbeat of the ocean. The water was freezing, the kind of cold that steals the breath from your lungs and slows your blood to a crawl. I kicked hard, pulling Rusty under the massive wooden pilings of the pier. We needed to stay submerged, using the structure as a shield against the searchlights that were already beginning to dance across the surface. This was the moment where training took over from fear. We were ghosts again, hidden in the one place they couldn't follow. The cold was no longer just a sensation. It had become a physical weight, a crushing force pressing against my ribs, trying to squeeze the very breath out of my lungs. We were shadows pinned against the rotting, barnacle-encrusted wood of the pier, while the world above us erupted in a chaotic symphony of light and violence. The searchlight from the sheriff's patrol boat cut through the midnight fog like a thermal lance, turning the dark, oily water into a blinding mirror of white and silver. I watched the beam pass, counting the seconds of the sweep with the mechanical precision of a sniper. 6 seconds of light, 4 seconds of darkness. That was our window to survive. Rusty was silent, a statue of muscle and fur, his head resting heavily on my shoulder as he treaded water with rhythmic, desperate strokes. His breathing was a faint, white puff of steam in the freezing air, the only sign of life in the gloom. This wasn't just a getaway anymore. It was a brutal test of endurance against an element that doesn't care if you're the hero or the villain. I could hear the muffled shouts of the deputies on the pier above, their heavy boots thumping like a frantic heartbeat directly over our heads. They knew we were down here. They knew their entire empire was leaking out into the bay with us. But the ocean is a vast, indifferent graveyard, and I knew its shifting currents and dark corners better than any small-town cop ever could. I felt the salt stinging the cuts on my face, a reminder that the price of the truth is always paid in blood and sweat. We stayed low, becoming part of the pier itself, waiting for the moment to break for the open sea. I looked at the bag gripped in my numb fingers. Inside that thin layer of waterproof plastic lay the total destruction of a legacy. The footage I'd captured through that ventilation grate wasn't just a recording of a crime. It was a high-definition map of a much larger, deeper infection that had taken hold of this coast. I saw the sheriff's face again in my mind's eye, the way his hands moved over that gold with a practiced, predatory grace, the way he spoke to his men like a general commanding a private army. He wasn't just a puppet of some distant cartel. He was the foreman, the master of ceremonies for a shadow economy that had been siphoning the lifeblood out of this town for decades. Every single frame on that SD card was a nail in the coffin of a corrupt system that had been strangling honest families like the Gables. As the freezing water swirled around me, I realized that Gable wasn't the first victim they'd broken, just the first one who had a friend with the skills to fight back. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than the tactical gear and the water combined. It wasn't about a simple act of revenge anymore. This was a surgical excision. We were the operators, and this dark harbor was the operating table where we would cut out the rot once and for all. I looked at the camera one last time before tucking it deep into my harness. It was more than technology now. It was a witness that couldn't be bribed, intimidated, or buried. In a world of lies, this was the only currency that mattered. We began the long, agonizing haul away from the structure. Swimming in full tactical gear with a 60-pound Malinois is a very specific, punishing kind of hell that only a few men truly understand. But the salt water was my native element, my sanctuary. I used the natural rhythm of the choppy waves to mask our movement, timing our strokes with the swell of the bay to stay below the line of sight of the guards on the shore. Behind us, the port had become a chaotic beacon of fire, steel, and panic. The distraction I'd set at the power hub was still roaring, a violent, jagged orange scar against the deep midnight blue of the stormy sky. The sheriff's boats were clustered around the pier like angry insects, their crews blinded by their own powerful searchlights, desperately searching for a splash that had occurred minutes ago. They were hunting ghosts in the white foam of the surf, convinced we were still trapped under the pilings, while the real threat was already 300 yards out, moving with the cold, silent intent of a shark in deep water. My muscles screamed in a dull, throbbing protest, a deep ache that started in my shoulders and radiated down through my core. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Every yard we gained was a yard further from their reach and a yard closer to justice. I looked at the smoke rising from the hangar and thought about the secrets it held. For years, they thought they were untouchable behind those fences. Tonight, they learned that no wall is high enough to keep out the truth. We reached the outer buoy line, a boundary that marked the edge of the harbor's controlled waters. I reached out and gripped the cold, slime-covered iron of a rusted mooring chain, using it to anchor us against the tug of the outgoing tide. My lungs were burning with a white-hot intensity, every breath feeling as if I were inhaling ground glass and salt. I stayed low, keeping only my nose and eyes above the waterline, watching the silhouette of a patrol boat cruise slowly past us, not 50 yards away. The vibration of its twin engines thrummed through the water, a low-frequency growl that I could feel in my very bones. Beside me, Rusty paddled with a stoic, relentless discipline, his eyes never leaving mine, serving as a silent anchor of loyalty in this shifting, liquid world. I checked the waterproof bag again, feeling the solid shapes of the camera and the ledger receipt through the plastic. They were still there, still dry. The only things that mattered in a world that was trying to drown us. I looked back at the harbor lights, now distant and twinkling like deceptive stars. The sheriff was likely on his radio at this very moment, pulling in every favor, closing every exit, and turning the entire coastline into a net. He had the badge, he had the manpower, and he had the local law on his side. With fingers that felt like stiff wooden pegs, I fumbled for the hidden compartment in the bag and pulled out my old satellite phone. It was a rugged, battered piece of tech, a relic from my days with the teams, encrypted with protocols that local towers couldn't even register, let alone track. The screen flickered to life, casting a ghostly blue glow over my wet, trembling hands, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness of the bay. I dialed a number I had burned into my memory years ago during a high-stakes operation in the Gulf, a number belonging to a man who lived in the shadows of the federal bureaucracy, someone who owed me a debt that money couldn't pay. The ringing tone was a lonely, rhythmic sound that seemed to stretch out forever, competing with the white noise of the wind and the crashing waves. Finally, the line clicked open, and a voice answered, low, cautious, and stripped of all emotion. "It's Jack," I whispered, my voice raspy from the salt and the cold. "I have the ghost of the harbor in my hand. The sheriff is the one running the fleet. I have the manifests, the gold counts, and clear footage of the entire transfer. I'm in the water, roughly 3 miles north of the main terminal. I need an immediate extraction and a secure handoff to someone outside the state's jurisdiction. This whole county is compromised from the top down." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end, the kind of silence that usually precedes a life-changing decision. Then, just 2 words. Vector confirmed. 10 minutes. The game hadn't just changed. It had evolved into a full-scale hunt. It was no longer about hiding from the sheriff's deputies. It was about holding our position until the cavalry arrived. The cold had moved beyond a mere physical sensation. It had become an intruder, a silent thief systematically stealing the motor functions from my fingers and the clarity from my weary mind. We had finally crawled onto a jagged spine of rock 1.5 miles from the pier, the sharp barnacles cutting deep into my palms as I dragged myself upward. But the biting pain was a distant, secondary concern. All I felt was the crushing weight of urgency. I laid out the yellow manifest that Rusty had snatched with such impossible precision, the singular piece of physical evidence that linked Sheriff Miller's private, jagged signature to the illegal shipments we had seen spilling from the bellies of the fish. As I stared at the dark ink, slightly blurred by the salt water but still undeniably legible, the staggering scope of the betrayal hit me with more force than the freezing waves of the harbor. This was never just a local corruption case. It was a logistics map for a ghost fleet that operated in the cracks of the world. The names written on this sodden paper weren't just local buyers. They were international shell companies, hollow entities that existed only to wash the blood and salt off this stolen gold. I looked at Rusty, his breath coming in rhythmic white plumes of steam, his loyal amber eyes reflecting the distant dying fires of the port. We were just 2 souls standing against a massive machine of greed that had been grinding this coastline into dust for decades. I realized then that the sheriff didn't just crave the money. He craved the absolute silence that only immense wealth can buy. He had built his kingdom on the broken backs of honest men like Gable, turning their very life's work into a shroud for his own darkness. Every violent shiver of my body was a reminder that the truth carries a high price, and tonight we were paying that debt in full. I traced the jagged signature with a thumb that had long since lost all feeling. Sheriff Miller. A man who sat in the front pew of the local church every single Sunday, who shook hands with the mayor at every town hall meeting, and who looked the citizens in the eye while promising to protect this county from the very darkness he was personally importing through the docks. This receipt was more than just a document. It was a cold confession written in his own arrogant hand. It meticulously listed the weight of the gold bullion, the serial numbers of the stolen jewelry, and the destination codes that matched the federal watch list I had spent months studying back during my time in the service. He wasn't just a common smuggler. He was an elite broker for a shadow state. I thought about the thousands of small, incremental decisions that lead a man to this point of total moral decay. The first small bribe. The first time he looked the other way for a friend. The first time he decided that a local fisherman's life was worth less than a single bar of gold. It is a slow, agonizing erosion of the soul until there is nothing left inside but a bottomless hunger for more. I could see the terrifying logic in his eyes back in that warehouse, the cold, calculating stare of a man who had long ago traded his silver badge for a hidden ledger. He had turned the sheriff's office into a glorified protection racket, using the very tools of justice to guard the gates of his own criminal empire. The special cargo listed here wasn't just contraband. It was the stolen future of this entire town. The accumulated equity of every honest worker being siphoned off to anonymous offshore accounts. I felt a surge of cold fury that burned far hotter than the hypothermia currently racking my bones. This scrap of paper was more than an entry in a logbook. It was a death warrant for Miller's career and a singular lifeline for the Gables. I tucked it back into the waterproof sleeve with the quiet reverence one might show a holy relic. The evidence was finally complete. Now we just had to survive the delivery of the verdict. Then, through the haze of my failing vision and the driving salt spray, I finally saw it. A low, dark shape was cutting through the heavy swells, silent and predatory like a deep-sea hunter. No lights, no blaring sirens, just the muffled, rhythmic hum of high-performance engines and the sharp white spray of a composite hull designed for one thing: the hunt. It was the Federal Interceptor. My contact in the shadows had come through after all. I reached up and clicked the small infrared strobe light mounted on my shoulder rig, the invisible pulse of light signaling our precise position to their advanced thermal optics. To any guard or deputy watching from the distant shore, we were nothing more than a faint shadow on a lonely rock. But to the professionals on that boat, we were a burning beacon of hope. I felt a momentary wave of relief wash over me, but I didn't dare let my guard down for even a second. A man like the sheriff had eyes and ears in every corner of this county, and a boat of that caliber doesn't move through these waters unnoticed for long. I looked back at the harbor one last time, seeing the orange glow of the fire I had started still licking at the sky. The bridge was burned, the secret was out, and there was no going back to the life I had built on the ranch. I grabbed Rusty's harness, feeling his steady heart beating against my hand. We had survived the dark, we had survived the water, and we had secured the truth. Now, as the interceptor roared closer, its bow wave throwing diamonds of salt water into the moonlight, I knew the real war was just beginning. We weren't just escaping, we were preparing to return with the full weight of the storm behind us. The transition from the cold, lonely rock to the vibrating, high-tech deck of the interceptor happened in a blur of disciplined motion. These men were silent professionals, shadows within shadows, their faces hidden behind ballistic masks and the haunting green glow of quad-eye night vision goggles. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. They saw the state I was in, the way my hands were locked in a permanent shiver, and they moved with a practiced efficiency that only comes from years of high-stakes extractions. One operator reached down, his gloved hand anchoring into my shoulder with a grip like iron, while the other skillfully hoisted Rusty upward by his harness handle, as if he weighed nothing at all. As soon as my boots hit the non-slip deck, I reached into my vest and pulled out the waterproof bag. I handed it to the lead operative, my fingers finally surrendering their grip. "It's all in there," I rasped, my voice barely audible over the low thrum of the triple outboards. "The manifests, the video, the gold counts, everything you need to tear Miller's world down to the foundation." He took the bag with a curt, respectful nod, his eyes behind the goggles unreadable, but his intent clear. He tucked it into a secure locker and signaled to the helmsman. I collapsed against a padded bench, the sudden warmth of a space heater on the deck hitting me like a physical wave. Rusty flopped down at my feet, his fur already being dried by a tactical blanket one of the men had thrown over him. For the first time in hours, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. We were no longer prey. We were the evidence. And as the boat turned its nose away from the coast and surged forward, the engines roaring into a full, guttural scream, I knew the sheriff's countdown had finally reached 0. I sat there in the dim, green-lit belly of the interceptor, watching the coastline of my home dissolve into the gray mist of the Atlantic. The lights of the port, once so threatening and sharp, were now nothing more than a faint, flickering blur on the edge of the world. Beside me, the federal agent was methodically checking the contents of the bag, the blue light from the camera's LCD screen reflecting off his visor as he reviewed the footage of the sheriff's betrayal. He didn't say a word, but the way his jaw tightened told me everything I needed to know. The truth was out, and it was devastating. Above us, the heavy storm clouds were finally beginning to fracture, revealing the very first, weakest hint of a cold, gray dawn on the eastern horizon. It was the end of the longest night of my life, but the beginning of a different kind of day, one where the shadows would finally be forced to face the light. I felt the powerful surge of the boat beneath me, a relentless force carrying us toward a secure facility where the process of justice would finally begin. I reached down and rested my hand on Rusty's head, feeling the coarse, drying fur. We had done what we came to do. We had taken the evidence from the belly of the beast and brought it into the light. The sheriff might still be sitting in his office, thinking he'd won, thinking the sea had swallowed his secrets, but he was already a dead man walking. The storm was coming for him now, and this time, it was carrying a badge that didn't answer to his name. I closed my eyes as the boat hit another swell, the rhythmic motion finally lulling me into a shallow, hard-earned sleep. The culmination was over. The reckoning was next. The dawn didn't break with a roar. It arrived with the cold, silent efficiency of a federal task force. By the time the sun began to peek over the Atlantic horizon, the harbor was no longer a fortress of secrets. It was a crime scene. I watched from the window of a black SUV as the empire Miller had built for 30 years crumbled in less than 30 minutes. They didn't even give him the dignity of a private arrest. He was cuffed in front of the men he'd corrupted, his silver badge, the symbol of the trust he'd betrayed, stripped from his chest by a man who didn't care about his local influence. The air was filled with the rhythmic strobing of blue and red lights, reflecting off the very crates that had held the stolen gold just hours before. I saw the look on the faces of the other deputies, the ones who hadn't been in on it. It was a mix of shock, shame, and a sudden terrifying realization that the world they knew was gone. Justice is often described as a blind goddess, but today she had her eyes wide open, and she was looking directly at every dark corner of this port. The manifests I'd recovered were already being fed into scanners, tracing the digital and physical breadcrumbs of a conspiracy that reached into the state capital. The sheriff looked toward the water one last time, perhaps searching for the ghost that had haunted his warehouse. But there was nothing there but the morning tide. The secret was out, the rot was being excised, and for the first time in a generation, the air in this town smelled like something other than diesel and deceit. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the pier, the gravel crunching under my boots. The Gables were already there, standing in the shadow of their boat, looking like people who had just been pulled from a wreckage. When Mr. Gable saw me, he didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The way he straightened his shoulders, the way the tension finally left his wife's face, told the whole story. They were no longer suspects or inspected parties. They were just a family again, with their livelihood returned and their name cleared of the filth Miller had tried to smear on it. I handed him back the small wooden carving of a fish I'd found near the crates, a lucky charm he'd carried for years. He took it with a hand that trembled slightly, his eyes reflecting a debt that could never be repaid with words. "The port is yours again, Gable," I said quietly. He nodded, a slow, solemn movement of a man who had seen the abyss and been pulled back from the edge. For guys like him, The ocean is a harsh mistress, but the land had proven to be much more dangerous. We stood there for a moment, watching the federal agents haul the last of the contraband away. The sea spirit sat low in the water, ready to head back out to the deep, where the only laws were the wind and the tide. It was a small victory in a large world, but for one family, it was everything. Rusty sat by my side, leaning against my leg, his job done, his loyalty rewarded by the simple peace of the morning sun. I reached the truck and pulled off my tactical gloves, the fabric stiff with salt and dried sweat. I dropped them into a bin, a symbolic act of leaving the operator behind and becoming a rancher again. My hands were a map of the night. Scraped knuckles, blue bruises from the impact of the fall, and the lingering paleness of the cold. I looked at them and realized that these hands were built for two things: protection and labor. Last night, they did the work they were trained for, but today, they were ready for the plow and the reins. I climbed into the cab, the familiar scent of old leather and dog fur wrapping around me like a warm blanket. Rusty was already settled in his spot, his eyes half closed, his chin resting on the metal tailgate as he watched the harbor recede in the rearview mirror. He didn't need a medal or a commendation. He just needed to know the mission was over. We were going home to a place where the air was clean and the shadows didn't hide gunmen. The ranch was waiting, with its endless chores and its quiet nights. The sheriff was headed to a cell, the Gables were headed to sea, and I was headed back to the only peace I'd ever known. But as I turned the key and the engine rumbled to life, I knew that the world was a little bit brighter today because two ghosts had decided to step out of the dark. The road home felt shorter than the road there. Maybe it was the weight of the evidence being gone, or maybe it was just the clarity that comes after a storm. I drove with the windows down, letting the fresh coastal air wash the last of the warehouse smoke from the cab. To my left, the Atlantic was a sheet of beaten silver, peaceful and vast, hiding its secrets once again beneath the waves. To my right, the hills were waking up, the dew glistening on the long grass like a field of diamonds. It's easy to forget that the world is beautiful when you spend your time looking for the rot in its shadows. But today, the beauty was undeniable. I looked over at Rusty, who was snoring softly now, his body twitching as he chased phantom rabbits in his sleep. He'd earned his rest. We both had. The life of a silent protector isn't about the glory or the credit. It's about the quiet moments afterward, when you can look at a sunrise and know that you did your part to make sure it happened for everyone else. The ranch appeared on the horizon, a cluster of weathered buildings that represented safety, hard work, and a future I'd fought to keep. The shadows were gone. The light was here. And for now, that was more than enough. I sat on the porch steps, the wood still cool from the night. The coffee in my hand was hot and bitter, just the way I liked it. The sun was fully up now, warming the boards and the fur of the dog at my feet. Rusty didn't move, even when a hawk circled overhead or the horses whinnied in the paddock. He was home. We were both home. I thought about the sheriff, sitting in a cold room somewhere, realizing that his silver star couldn't save him from the truth he'd tried to drown. I thought about the Gables, out on the water, free to live their lives without fear. And then I stopped thinking about the past and started looking at the present. The grass needed mowing, the fence in the north pasture needed repair, and the sun was going to keep rising whether I was there to see it or not. But I would be there. I would be there to watch over this corner of the world, a silent sentinel with a loyal dog and a history that stayed in the shadows where it belonged. The story of the ghost of the harbor was over, but the story of Jack and Rusty was just beginning another quiet chapter. And as the screen fades, remember one thing: no matter how deep you bury it, no matter how much salt and water you pour over it, the truth has a way of coming to the surface. Always.